start.
Okay, so we're starting. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining ANAH's and I this evening for our third ATS and ANAH event, a collaborative project between the Art and Technology Studies Department and Artists Need Art Historians Student Group. Tonight's event features Christopher Cutrone. Chris Cutrone teaches in the departments of Art History, Theory and Criticism, and Visual and Critical Studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He is an instructor at the Institute for Clinical Social Work and was a longtime lecturer in the Social Sciences Collegiate Division at the University of Chicago, where he completed the PhD degree in the Committee on the History of Culture and the MA in the Art History. His doctoral dissertation was on Adorno's Marxism. He received the MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the BA from Hampshire College. He is also a writer and media artist, committed to critical thinking and artistic practice and the politics of social emancipation. He is the original lead organizer of the Platypus Affiliated Society, an international Marxist educational project. This event will be in the form of an informal dialogue, not lecture-based. During this discussion, we will discuss some of the themes present in the following text: the relevance of critical theory to art today, written by Chris in 2011 for the Platypus Affiliated Society, Critique of Revolutionary Art, Trotsky, Benjamin, Adorno, and Greenberg, written by Chris for Cesara, Art and Politics in Our Epoch by Leon Trotsky, and the author as producer by Walter Benjamin. We will be monitoring the chat box, so if anyone would like to participate in the discussion, please make sure to leave your questions and we'll read them aloud. Without further ado, please welcome Chris Cutrone. So Chris, let's start off by discussing the title of this event, The Critical Theory of Art as Technology. When I initially wrote to you, I asked you to give critical theory, art, and technology a sexier title. And I'm curious to learn about your use of as in place of and.
I think that I was influenced by Walter Benjamin and his treatment of art as technology. And his treatment of technology as a prosthesis, right? So the idea of art as an extension of our humanity in the same way that technology is, in some ways it responds to Martin Heidegger's contemporaneous treatment of art as technology, but from a Marxist perspective rather than from a Heideggerian perspective.
So we're going to discuss the first text, the relevance of critical theory to art today, in which you were part of a panel. And your response was, in the Hegelian sense adopted by both Marx and Adorno, the greater consciousness of freedom is the only available path for freedom's possible realization. Consciousness is tasked to recognize the potential that is its own condition of possibility. This is why Adorno and Benjamin addressed works of art as forms of consciousness. Art can be ideological or it can enlighten, provoking consciousness to push itself further. So Kant, Hegel, and Schiller all spoke of beauty and freedom and the free play of imagination that leads one to judge the object as beautiful. Your panelist response that I just read also made me think of when I asked you in class, if or has capitalism calcified imagination? And your response was, maybe not calcified it, but terrorized it. So how could critical theory, for those that may be new to Marxist critical theory, potentially help to shield today's artists from this terror or terrorizing, or can it shield?
Well, I feel like you've brought in psychology. And so by bringing in psychology, as you know, the Frankfurt School was very much influenced by Freud. And Freud thought that the way we overcome the problems of psychology is through greater awareness, greater self-consciousness, greater self-recognition. And so the idea would be that critical theory, having a critical theory of our social historical context, our conditions, can help alleviate what would otherwise be the terror of the present, the kind of immediacy of reality, of social reality, of historical circumstances, that we could tamp down that psychological terror simply by virtue of being critically self-aware of our circumstances and how they affect us. So, that it can do some small help towards alleviating the terror of capitalism. But, thought of more broadly than just psychologically, I would say that art participates in society. It's a product of society, but it participates in society, and art is part of historical change. It both is affected by historical change and it contributes to historical change. And recognizing that process, that's what thinkers in this tradition mean by consciousness. They don't just mean how we think about things. They don't only mean our theory of things or our conceptual understanding of things, but consciousness is always practical. And art is a practical participation in society. It's a domain where we become self-conscious of what we're doing practically, at least in the aesthetic realm.
Anais, would you like to discuss the art and politics in our epoch?
Sure. Yeah, so to scoot ahead to Trotsky. So Trotsky's point, art and politics in our epoch, is similar to the Hegelian treatment by Marx and then Adorno, in that art needs a critical criticism in order to actually exist as art. Trotsky recognized this idea with the falsification and the crisis of thought and revolutionary thought presented by socialist realism and what it represented for the USSR. What would we say about the nature of falsification as it relates to subjectivity in politics over time without a substantial critical political struggle where Trotsky had that?
Right. So, when thinking about these kinds of thinkers from 100 years ago, roughly 100 years ago, from the early 20th century, one advantage that they had that we might lack is that they were living in a time of tumultuous change, but they were also living in a time of heightened political agency, subjectivity, right? The idea that revolutionary politics, politics that really self-consciously aimed to transform society at a substantial foundational level, was closely related to the way that art radically challenged and questioned and sought to transform our aesthetic subjectivity. So these things were very closely related. 20th century avant-garde emerging out of World War I, and the kind of ferment that you saw in the 20s and 30s, the interwar period. That's the period that Trotsky was writing in. His criticism of socialist realism as a kind of an official style was that it actually didn't do justice to just how radical the crisis in society was, and also how radical the responses of artists were at the time. He thought that the condemnation of modernism in the Soviet Union, but also elsewhere, modernism was, of course, condemned by fascism. And modernism didn't have, we tend to think of like post-World War II celebration and institutionalization of modernism in the United States or in the West. But before that, modernism struggled and was controversial and was marginal. And so it didn't have the kind of official institutionalized sanction that it got later. So it was important for someone like Trotsky to point out that the crisis of society really extended broadly and deeply into all various domains of activity, including in the realm of art and culture. In other words, that it wasn't just like an economic crisis with the Great Depression. It wasn't just a political crisis in terms of the polarization between fascism and communism in the 30s, but it was also a broader social and therefore cultural crisis that artists responded to, whether they thought of themselves as political or not, or whether they had an understanding of modern history and capitalism and capitalist society or not. They were nonetheless responding to that situation. And you know, Trotsky wasn't only speaking as a Marxist, but just more broadly, there was an understanding that the crisis in society reached into all realms and deeply into people's subjectivity and even into their psychology, as we were talking about a little while ago, and that art is tasked to be true to its own time, but not to be true to its own time in the sense of affirming its time, which is what socialist realism tended to do. It tended to just affirm social reality as it is, or aspects of social reality, like affirm like working class existence or things like that. Not to justify or legitimize, not to give a kind of aesthetic kind of justification for life as it was, but really to play more critically off existing social reality in life. So the distance and the antagonism between art and life was actually seen as vitally important, right? So whereas in the Soviet Union, modernist artists were condemned as antisocial, right, as individualistic, as formalistic, as too hermetic, as alienated from the people, Trotsky defended artists insofar as the alienation of their practice from the greater society actually spoke to the alienation at the heart of society and capitalism.
I guess that gets to the other question that we had, which is something you bring up in the critique of revolutionary art panel, or at least your talk, is about the Marxism's relationship to like modernism via 1848. Like, how is this brought about, or can we speak more about it?
Right. So a couple of catchphrases that we have from the history of Marxism that were deeply influential for people like Trotsky, but also for the Frankfurt School, for Benjamin, for Adorno, and also for others like Clement Greenberg in the United States, various Marxist critics and art historians. So we have from the Communist Manifesto from 1848, we have Marx and Engels describing capitalism, saying, in capitalism, all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and humankind is forced to face its conditions with sober senses. The other quotation is more anecdotal. It's from Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution. But before he led the Russian Revolution, he was living in exile. That's where he spent most of his life before the revolution, was living in exile outside of Russia in Western Europe. And he was, during World War I, living in Switzerland, because Switzerland's a neutral country, so it was a safe place for a lot of emigre political radicals. And he was in Zurich, and he happened to attend a Dada happening, performance, event, and he was asked by one of the attendees, a younger man, he said, well, what did you think about that? And Lenin said, we have to be as radical as reality itself. He prefaced that by saying, in response to the young man's question, are we revolutionary enough? And Lenin said, I don't know. I don't know if I'm revolutionary enough. I don't know if anyone is revolutionary enough. The task is to be as radical as reality itself. So the idea being, going back to the 19th century, going back to the era of the Industrial Revolution, and from a Marxist perspective, of capitalism per se, this is a revolutionary society. This is a society that's in constant tumult, that's in constant upheaval, that's in constant flux and change. And in many ways, capitalism is more revolutionary than any of our practices can be. In other words, the actual social revolution unleashed by capitalism is more radical and more revolutionary than humans can keep up with. So another phrase of Marx's, going back, that's Marx's formative moment is the mid-19th century, that the ideological superstructure changes much more slowly than the socioeconomic base, right? The idea that our consciousness, our thinking, our theory, but also our practice, our actual activity in society lags behind, subjectively lags behind the objective process of change unleashed by capitalism. Another image that we have from the Communist Manifesto is that of the sorcerer's apprentice who unleashes magical powers that he can't control, right? That's what capitalism had done. So of course we should have Disney's Fantasia in mind, and Mickey Mouse as the sorcerer's apprentice. Mickey Mouse, of whom Walter Benjamin was quite fond, in fact, saying that Mickey Mouse was truer to art as technology than a lot of official art was, in terms of official high culture, high art. Maybe not radical modernism, avant-garde art, but certainly the more approved styles in the official culture. Certainly Mickey Mouse is more radical than socialist realism, that's for sure.
I guess that brings us to a conversation of how the claim is that the avant-garde is sort of modeled after Marxism in that way of evincing the feeling of time or the aesthetic of time, as opposed to kitsch and its crystallization.
Right. So Greenberg has his famous essay Avant-Garde and Kitsch, which I think is really helpful and productive. Sees these as twin phenomena. The avant-garde and kitsch are really both the products of capitalism, are both modernist culture. But where the avant-garde is the vanguard, very much like Marxism understood itself as the political vanguard, or more precisely, Marxism understood the struggle of the working class in capitalism as the vanguard for discontents in society as a whole, since capitalism affects everyone in the society and creates a lot of discontents. That the avant-garde is the advanced guard, it's out front, and kitsch is the rear guard, bringing up the rear, coming in, behind. And the way Greenberg put it was, kitsch imitates the avant-garde, meaning everything that's avant-garde becomes kitsch. It becomes just a stylistic innovation that's ultimately assimilated to culture in capitalism, to broader culture in capitalism. And the avant-garde imitates the processes of art. The avant-garde imitates the processes of art. Now, Benjamin and Adorno, like Greenberg, regarded the processes of art as themselves forces of production. Forces of production. And when we think of it that way, again, art is technology. It's a peculiar kind of technology, but it also, helps us see what technology really is. In other words, technology is not just sort of things and machines or just techniques. It's also form, right? So technology in art or technique in art is a matter of form, of aesthetic form. And again, to imitate the processes of art is to imitate the processes of our aesthetic subjectivity, how our imagination gives form to the world. And avant-garde modernist art really tried to push the envelope and explore the potential possibilities of new ways of imagining the world that capitalism gave rise to in modernity. And again, so the avant-garde is out there kind of exploring the limits of formal meaning and aesthetic technique. And then kitsch is there to assimilate all of that to stylistic innovations in capitalist popular culture, which, like everything else in capitalism, has to constantly change to try to keep up with changes in society. So it's a peculiar notion of technology, but it's a peculiar notion of form involved when looked at from the standpoint of art. So people like Greenberg and Benjamin and Adorno, and even Trotsky, even though Trotsky's concerns were primarily political, they thought that you could not only look at art from the standpoint of society, that you could like take social reality as your context for art, but you could also look at society aesthetically. In other words, you could open up critical questions of society by subjecting society to an aesthetic critique, to looking at how society is held together by aesthetic forms and not only by political and economic forms. And of course, this is why there was a great affinity between the surrealists and not only Benjamin, who was their friend and hung out with them, and they actually saved his work when he fled Paris. They saved his papers, so that's why we have them in large measure. But also the surrealists were collaborators with Trotsky. And the reason for this is that both Benjamin and Trotsky, as Marxists, were sympathetic to the surrealist critique of capitalism, which was an aesthetic critique of capitalism. In other words, they thought that it could go both ways. You could have a social critique of aesthetics, but you could also have an aesthetic critique of society. And I think that brings us back to something that Bopa raised earlier with Kant and Schiller and Hegel, these earlier thinkers who raised those kinds of questions about aesthetic imagination, the aesthetic character of social forms and cultural forms in a different revolutionary moment, the moment of the late 18th and early 19th century, the time of the American and French revolutions. The time of the Enlightenment, of course, but also the time of the great social and political upheavals of the 1700s. And very deliberately related their thinking about aesthetics, aesthetic subjectivity, and art to the social and political changes of their time.
Okay. I think there was another question by Anisa for the art and politics in our epoch. Would we call tendentiousness a potential liability, a falsification outside of the USSR historical context?
So I noticed that you included in your reading list, which I thought was good, Benjamin's author as producer.
Yes.
And so he talks about this. He tries to resituate the discussion of art and politics, but also the discussion of form and content as one of tendency and quality. So what's the relationship of political tendency to artistic quality? Or the way he puts it, because he really focuses on writing as an art form and the author as producer, literary quality. And then he combines those two, so the political tendency, like what the political allegiance, what kind of politics does the art serve, or seek to serve, try to serve. So political tendency, and then literary quality, which he defined as educational. In other words, does the literary and artistic quality of a work, the aesthetic quality of a work, the formal quality of the work, is educational in the sense that it makes the readers into writers, it makes the viewers into artists, and it makes artists and writers better at their writing and at their art, right? That's the measure of the aesthetic quality, the formal quality, the literary or artistic quality of a work. But then he brings in a third term, which he calls literary tendency. In other words, not political tendency or literary quality, not political tendency or artistic quality, but artistic tendency, which was his way of thinking about progress. In other words, is there progress? Is there historical progress in art or in literature? And how would you begin to measure that? Right? And again, he had this idea of, is it advanced or is it retrograde? Right? Again, is it kind of pushing the envelope? So tendency there would be avant-garde or rear guard, you know, vanguard or rear guard, that you could have partisanship in the realm of art at the level of making claims to progress. And again, progress would be measured by the educational value. Does it enhance the people's, you know, starting with artists, own aesthetic sensibility, own subjectivity? Does it advance them? Does it educate them? Does it empower them as viewers, as readers? Does it make them more aware, more self-conscious of their aesthetic experience? That's a hard one, isn't it? And yet it's actually a very old idea. In other words, it's the old kind of bourgeois Enlightenment idea that art should be enlightening. You know, which doesn't mean necessarily didactic, right? Because didactic is more like programmatic. Enlightening in the sense of, does it enhance our general awareness of things in the artistic and aesthetic realm? And does that open up? Does that enhance our awareness, our consciousness of reality as a whole? You know, again, the old bourgeois Enlightenment thinkers certainly thought that that's what art's role was. Again, the imagination as a fundamental faculty, that the imagination informs everything. It informs science, right? Like we tend to think of, I don't know what, STEM, right? Versus like creative, like left brain, right brain or some nonsense, right? You know, that you're either creative, in which case nothing that you do really matters, or you do like really serious solid stuff, in which case it's all kind of mathematical engineering. But you know, Marxism, the old style Marxism, had a lot more in common with the old bourgeois Enlightenment, which thought that the imagination leads the other faculties, right? It actually is foundational for other modes of inquiry and other practical advancements. The imagination informs everything. It informs our understanding, our concepts. It informs our scientific investigations. It informs our practical innovations. And the educator of the imagination is art.
We have a question in the chat. What would be the role of art after the revolution?
Hopefully to do what I was just talking about in a less constrained way. In other words, if we think about this mission of art, this task of art, as leading by imagination, then we have to think of how that is impaired, how that is constrained and distorted in capitalism. And again, one could say that there's an interest in transforming capitalism and getting beyond capitalism, not just on an economic level or on a political level, but also on a cultural level and an artistic level. In other words, that capitalism really constrains and distorts and dominates, terrorizes. That's the language we were using earlier on. It really does constrict the imagination. It's hard to exercise the imagination in a state of fear, and capitalism keeps us in a state of fear, if not of terror. That impairs the imagination. So the role of art beyond capitalism would hopefully be to be liberated to fulfill its mission in a way that it really cannot, even though it continues to try to under capitalism. It's really fundamentally impaired under these conditions.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Irina Bukant. Where would you situate Benjamin's dialectical image in relationship with imagination?
Well, in fact, I was just teaching this today in my MFA grad survey course this afternoon. We were looking at Benjamin's On the Concept of History, otherwise known as the Theses on the Philosophy of History, and some related texts around it. And of course, the dialectical image. In the Arcades project, the dialectical image is a core conceptual category of Benjamin's. What this means is, of course, the image of contradiction, meaning the dialectical image is the image that captures contradiction in itself. It becomes an image of contradiction. And he was referring to it in that circumstance as historical. So what kind of image does the past yield to us? How do we see the past? How does the past appear in a contradictory way to us? How does it present a dialectical image to us? But elsewhere in other writings by Benjamin, he does address the dialectical image as more of a present phenomenon, a present day contemporary phenomenon. Now, of course, when the past creates a dialectical image, an image of contradiction, that's a function of the present as well, meaning that's in the way the present is regarding the past. So this kind of collision of past and present, right? That's what he most developed in his ideas of the dialectical image, mostly around the Arcades project. But he also had that understanding of surrealism as a contemporary avant-garde practice, that the surrealists, and again, as a rejoinder to socialist realism, surrealism, we tend to forget because we're not French speaking, doesn't mean other than real. It doesn't mean like fantastical. It means very real, right? Surreal means like extremely real. That's what it means. So extreme realism rather than other than realism or fantastical and unreal. And he thought the surrealists depicted reality, grasped reality aesthetically, objectified our imagination, our actual experience in our imagination of reality better than socialist realism did. And it did so precisely by presenting what he thought were dialectical images. In other words, that it condensed, this is why dreams and Freudian psychoanalysis were so important to the surrealists, because their understanding of surrealism, of this kind of extreme intensified realism as a condensed reality, that art was not other than reality, and it also wasn't less than reality. It wasn't like a representation of reality, which means that it would be less than reality. It was actually more reality. It was an intensified reality. It was a condensed reality. But then the task is to condense, intensify reality in terms of its contradictions. In other words, to present the contradictory character of reality in a pointed form, in a pointed way.
That would be the role of the critic, right? To recognize and grasp the contradiction.
Yes, of course. So the artist presents it, and the critic recognizes it, hopefully. And, in that sense, the recognition of what the artist does helps advance art, because it helps inspire other artists, right? It helps increase our consciousness of what's going on in art. And art helps us understand what's going on in our experience of reality. Yeah, so art adds to reality, and criticism hopefully adds to the art. Hopefully it doesn't like reduce the art or subtract from it. Unfortunately, I think that is what criticism tends to do. By contrast, it doesn't add anything. It actually kind of detracts from the art. So there is such thing as bad criticism, bad theory, that's kind of giving short shrift to the art. So, again, the artist is under a task. The critic or the theorist is under that task, a similar task too, right? And that's to hopefully advance consciousness, help us grasp in a practically inspiring and fertile way, productive way, what we're doing and how we're experiencing the world.
Okay, so should we discuss the author as producer since
that came up?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. ANAH?
Oh, okay. In the Benjamin piece, has the hack or someone who doesn't further the production apparatus, thus exemplified by the objectivity and the role of beautiful, been detrimental for an understanding of art's transformative potential?
Yeah, this is a strange category of Benjamin's and the author as producer. He talks about, the choice facing the artist. And, he starts off with the choice facing the artist as, are you siding with the proletariat or are you siding with the capitalist bourgeoisie? He starts out with that one. But then he moves it into the realm of, are you feeding the apparatus or are you seeking to transform it? So that term apparatus, it's tricky because it refers to, the society, the culture, the structures, if you will, the institutions, the conventions that exist around culture and around art. And so artists can just feed that system, just sort of plug in more material, more content into that existing cultural, social reality, or they can seek to change it. But the question is, how do you change it, in fact? And that's, what I mentioned earlier, the educational role of art. So apparatus is not only that kind of social institutional realm, but it's also our very subjectivity. In other words, it's something internalized at the level of the reader or the viewer or the listener. So the apparatus, are you feeding the apparatus? Or are you just giving the people what they want? Right? Or are you changing them? And again, what's the domain in which art can affect change? It can change or at least affect our aesthetic subjectivity, our imagination. It can open up our imagination to new kinds of possibilities, new kinds of experiences, new aesthetic experiences. And again, that's where formal innovation would be important. Which always has an experimental character, meaning we're not sure what the effect of formal innovation will be. We try, and we try in such a way where the reader or the viewer or the listener is in on that process, right? Is able to follow that process and therefore judge that process. In other words, judge its effectiveness, to be aware of the effect it's having on them, and to judge that effect. So the apparatus, it's something that we create collectively, but it's also in the individual subjectivity. And that's really where art operates. And that individual subjectivity doesn't exist in a vacuum, of course. It exists very much as part of, and it is indeed the product of, the greater society and culture, you know, which includes the political and economic world as well. So that apparatus, yeah. And so the hack, right? The hack artist, the hack writer is one that just operates in terms of the way things are and does not seek to transform that circumstance, that situation. You know, only meets the viewer or the reader or the listener where they are already, rather than seeking to move them. You know, and again, move them imaginatively, move them in terms of a further education of their aesthetic subjectivity.
Okay, we have another question from Irina Buchan. Is the dialectical image his method in the Arcades project, in Benjamin's Arcade project?
Yes, of course. So, you know, method, it's tricky. The method of Marxism, and Benjamin was a Marxist, is immanent critique, immanent dialectical critique. So critiquing something from within immanently, and critiquing meaning exploring its possibilities for potential change. To do that dialectically, the dialectical image as a method is to explore conditions of change as a function of contradiction. So, you know, this is the Hegelian dimension of Marxism, that Marxism regards the appearance of contradiction as an indication of potential change, of the necessity and possibility for change. That potential change that hasn't happened yet first appears as a self-contradiction in what exists. So the method of the dialectical image is to present reality in such a way that its potential for change is revealed, so that the way things are, existing reality, can point beyond itself, can point to its potential transformation. So again, that's what it would mean to say that Benjamin tried to use the dialectical image as a method, as a critical method, right? It has to do with how a critical essay, a critical work, can present reality in its contradiction, and therefore present reality not merely as it is, but how it points beyond itself. Now, with the Arcades project, he's doing it with history. In other words, he's actually showing how the 19th century pointed beyond itself to something other than the 20th century. Meaning the 20th century was regarded rather as a repetition of the 19th century, or as a continuation of the 19th century. Whereas the task of the historian, from Benjamin's perspective, was to reveal how it didn't necessarily have to be that way. In other words, the 19th century contained other possibilities. That we were not, the present is not, the future that the past dreamed of. Right, so that's what reading history against the grain is, et cetera, et cetera. But the dialectical image in terms of not a historical phenomenon, you know, with the work of history like the Arcades project, where he's talking about the past, the dialectical image would be something that the critic would try to present about the present, about present reality, that the essayist or the critical theorist would try to present existing reality in its contradiction in order to show its potential for change. And that's hard, by the way, because we tend to be partisan about present reality. In other words, we take sides in present reality, and what that can neglect is that the totality of present reality includes all of its sides. It's not just one side or another side, and that the relationship of these different sides, if you will, the partisanship in reality, is actually a function of sides of a contradiction, meaning the truth is on both sides, and the truth is beyond both sides. But in our kind of partisan environment, we tend to just enforce one side and annihilate the other side, nullify the other side. That's not dialectical, to say the least. It also leads nowhere, as will be apparent within the next few months.
Okay.
The most polarized election of all time, and it will be remarkable how little changes.
Okay. So we have another question by Sam, or sorry, a question by Sam. Do you think it's mutually exclusive to be a hack and to move with art?
It's not mutually exclusive. It's not. However, there is the issue of with what consciousness. And not only in the part of the artist, but also on the part of the artist's audience. Meaning, certainly a work is not reducible to the consciousness of its creator, of the artist, right? So a work can certainly go beyond the consciousness of its creator. But the idea is that the consciousness of the creator matters, right? It's not determinative, but it is a condition. It does matter in some way. And the issue here is not like consciousness in terms of like being a Marxist or something. Rather, so for Benjamin and the author as producer, it's rather consciousness as an artist. In other words, how aware, and it doesn't matter in what terms, but how aware is the artist of what they're actually doing, right? So their self-consciousness aesthetically as an artist. Myself, having an art background, but also teaching at art school now, right, for a long time, for almost 20 years, I'm aware of the fact, right, that artists are not encouraged terribly to be very self-conscious of their work at that level, at the aesthetic level, They're made very conscious of their work at a social level and at a cultural level, right? Social responsibility, social justice concerns. But they're very rarely allowed to talk about what art is really about, which is aesthetic form, right? And so, I think that really impairs the work that's produced. I think that, we've done a disservice to young artists by not focusing their education on the artistic aspects of art, the aesthetic aspects of art, what makes it art and not something else, what makes it art and not activism, what makes it art and not like research, right, or scholarship. No, right, those are other things, right? Be an activist, be a researcher, be a scholar, but to be an artist, you have to be an artist, right? So, the category of the hack artist is simply the artist who never questions the art aspect of their art, right? Whereas, obviously that's the big existential question for the artist. So the artist who doesn't ever face the existential question of their work, what are they doing, but who just sort of rattle it off by rote, inevitably does their own work a disservice.
Okay, so we have a question from Armin. We tend to have polarized reactions and responses to tech, both in society and in art. On one side, we want to go back into a primitive state to take refuge in nature and rebuke tech. On the other extreme end, for example, we want to turn humans into robots and we glorify machines, similar to what futurists did. We want to become the machines. As you said earlier, it seems we're having a hard time to adapt and respond to this speed of change and this vast gap Can we have any mediation regarding tech and capitalism, or are we only tasked to express and critique?
I would say that, again, seeing art as technology, as itself technological in that way, means participating in technological change, if you will. In other words, not just responding to technology, but recognizing that technology is us. It is us. So it's not that we're going to turn humans into machines. We are machines. We are machines. We're organic machines, and we're also organic machines that have been transformed by society. And therefore, we're also artificial machines and social machines, and not just natural organic machines. We're both. And, our psychology, our cultural practices are part of that. They're part of that. So, again, this more expanded view of what technology is, that it's an experiential, aesthetic, and subjective thing, and not just it's an internal thing. It's not just an external, objective thing. That's difficult because I think capitalism inevitably hives these things off. In other words, it alienates us from ourselves. And one way that we are alienated from ourselves is to talk about this external thing, technology. Technology is just us. It's just us. It's just our own doing. It's our own instrumentality. Again, I mentioned earlier that Benjamin treats technology as a prosthesis, as an extension of the body, as an extension of our humanity. And yet, of course, in capitalism, we experience it as something else, as something that has a force of its own, outside of us, external to us, and something that we can, again, reject or accept, celebrate or condemn, as if it's something apart from us, right? So when we do that, what we're really doing is expressing an attitude towards our own historical being, towards what we are, right? Because technology is us. It's part of us. It's an extension of us. We are technology. We are a technology of nature. Nature produces its own little machines, right? We got a little COVID-19 machine running around, and we don't like the way it interacts with the Homo sapiens machine very much, right? We are machines in a world of machines. And we also self-consciously change those machines and affect them and create our own machines. And so it's natural, however, in capitalism, for the contradictory character of technology to take the form of partisanship, of being for or against it, of celebrating it or condemning it, etc. And that's just a kind of lack of deeper recognition that it is us and we are it.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I'm sorry, guys. I know there are 2 more questions in the chat box, but we're nearing the hour and we have to wrap up. So our apologies. But thank you, Chris. It's always a great pleasure and a great privilege to be able to engage in critical dialogue with you. I was taking notes literally at the same time. And, brain tenderized or massaged as
Indeed.
So, but for anyone,
no, thanks a lot.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. So for anyone that's interested in continuing this dialogue with Chris, there is a SIC coffee break where we meet virtually every Wednesday from 4:30 to 6:30. I'm sorry, 6 p.m. CST. Also, if you would like to learn more about what is the left and what is Marxism, there's a SAIC Platypus Primary Marxist Reading Group that meets online every Monday from 6 to 9 p.m. CST. I will share the syllabus and my email address. Please email me if you're interested in joining. I can send you the Zoom link. And thank you everyone for joining ANAH and I tonight. Please be sure to tune in again as ATS and speaks with Dr. Eugenia Chang on Friday November 20th, as she discusses math, art, and social justice. Chris, do you have any closing last words or any provocative?
No, just that's no, nothing provocative. Just thank you, Anais, and thank you, Bopa, and thanks everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Take good care.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.